So let's start by welcoming you to the Race Equality Centre. Let's start by sharing that this is the penultimate evening of the Human Rights Arts and Film Festival, which started on the 4th of December. And we know it's going to be finished tomorrow, which is the 10th. Tomorrow being the International Human Rights Day. Actually, yesterday was the 50th anniversary of the Race Relations Act. So all of these events happening are very poignant to legislation that were created to assist us in our daily living. I'm going to be trying to chair the meeting, but as I said, it's going to be free and flowing. We do have apologies from a few individuals who have initially stated that they could attend. One is Michael Barker, Socialist Party, and Chris Williams, from the Green Party, and Richard Johnson. So we have with us Andrew Walton from TUSC and Matthew Albert from the Lib Dems. We are going to ask them to speak to us for 10 minutes each on should Britain retain or replace the Human Rights Act, following which we'll engage in the discussion I spoke to you about earlier. Okay, is that all right? Yeah. So if we start with Andrew, because he's the first person on my list and I can, perhaps you will kick us off, please.
One of the things that prompted me to write down my thoughts about this was I went to the Music Without Borders event the other day, and some of the people there, as I was paying my ticket to go in, asked me, well, why would they want to get rid of the Human Rights Act? What are the government trying to do? And I was a bit stumped, actually, because it's such common sense when you think about it. The Human Rights Act enshrines in our law, and it's a European legislation, but it's also in British law as well, basic human rights: the right to life, the right to freedom, the right to a fair trial, the right not to be tortured, really quite basic things that are part of any Western grown-up democracy that we should have. And if the government are trying to water this down, they're trying to bring in they're calling the British Bill of Rights, and their only possible motive for doing so would be to water down the existing legislation. If we look at the direction of travel the government are going with various legislation that they've brought in, they've clamped down on the freedom of trade unionists to take strike action by making it having to have a 40% mandate for strike action if you're balloting, and the average ballot, on those terms, most Tory MPs would not be elected, most politicians would not be elected in Parliament, because turnouts aren't always that high. And it would have to be about 80% majority saying yes and a 50% turnout to get that. First, one example of rights being taken away from us. So I think that the trajectory this is going down would be to weaken or abolish our responsibilities, international responsibilities to do with human rights completely. One of the things that the New Labour in 2004 fell foul of with the Human Rights Act was in 2004, after the Iraq War and the threat of terrorism, they tried to bring in what was called a definite detention without trial for foreign prisoners. And this was challenged in the courts, and it went up to the courts, up to the House of Lords, which is the highest court in the country. And they said it was incompatible with the Human Rights Act, the European Convention on Human Rights, that the government were trying to do this. They didn't have the power to actually, the UNHCR doesn't have the power to change the law itself. But what they can say is, this is incompatible with human rights in Europe. And so it puts huge amounts of pressure on the government to actually change the law, and that's actually what happened. And they said that it's wrong to lock up people indefinitely without trial. The European Convention on Human Rights came about after the Second World War, and what it was an attempt, after the horrors of the Nazi regime, the racism, the victimization of minorities, disabled people, etc., simply to make it illegal, that these things were completely out of order and should never happen again in a civilized country. And so this legislation was brought in the right includes the right of assembly, the right to freedom of speech, the right to protest, and to have our voice in society. Now, one big group of people, and at TREC, that this is very relevant actually to here, would be asylum seekers. Now, they're denied a voice in society, and you can argue they're getting a very rough deal. The government seems to be going out of their way to make life as difficult as possible for anyone entering this country, fleeing persecution, fleeing war. And at the same time, we're going to war, of course, in the Middle East, just making the problem worse, a cycle of violence and terror. And so I think that the Human Rights Act, in this respect, is absolutely vital, because it at least gives the government that excuse. They can't make that excuse that it is not acceptable, because there is international legislation that people should be treated decently, they should be given a fair trial, they should have the right to look for a job and actually live in a country. Now, that's why I think the Tories are against it and want to water it down. And it would be nice, and this is the second debate we've had that they haven't turned up to, just to defend their position. And it's left to the small parties. And the problem with the last debate actually was that we all ended up agreeing with each other. There wasn't a huge amount of controversy, because it is such common sense. And I do think that although it was done, instigated in 1948, a long time ago, actually the values of tolerant democracy, where we can have differences of opinion, can express our thoughts and celebrate different religions freely, is more relevant now than it ever has been in a multicultural, plural society that Britain is. And I think we should celebrate its vibrancy and diversity, and Leicester is such a good example of that in this city in particular. So I would stand by completely with the Human Rights Act. I think if I'm going to have a criticism of it, I think in some respects it doesn't quite go far enough. It says things like, what it lacks, I think, is economic freedoms. You have the right to be in the country, but you don't have the right to a decent wage. One of the things the Socialist Party fights for is a £10 an hour minimum wage, for example. It says nothing about inequality. And it says nothing about the rights that have been taken away from us by people not being able to access justice through the legal system, when they've taken away the rights for free legal aid, for example, that the government has also done. Because in order to access these rights, you've got to know the law, you've got to know your way around a very complex bureaucratic system. And there's a lot of people in this country, and TREC work with a lot of people and advise people in Leicester, their rights. And that's part of what is going on. A lot of people are being denied rights, and we've even got, with the redrawing of the electoral boundaries and people being made to re-register on the electoral register, even the right to vote is being taken away from a lot of people in this country, by stealth, if you like. And then the government are bringing in also what's been called the Snoopers Charter, an invasion of our right, which is enshrined in the Human Rights Act, to privacy as well. So a lot of rights are under threat, and I think we need to stand up to protect them. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.